All right, we are recording now. So first and foremost, I'd like to go ahead and call this meeting of the School Corporation Fiscal and Qualitative Indicators Committee to order. I appreciate everybody being here today. This is a meeting where we're following up on some conversations we had last week, so certainly looking forward to everybody's input and feedback. Also would just like to take a second to recognize compliance with the open door law. The notice and agenda were posted on the DUAB webpage prior to this meeting. We also do, as I indicated, we have all of our committee members here today, so we do have the presence of a quorum as well. So with that, before we jump too far into the real content, I do just have some WebEx type intro comments I want to provide. Fortunately, if you all are already here, then you have figured out how to connect. But in case you do encounter any issues, just making sure folks know that we do have 3 different ways to connect to this meeting through just a web browser. There's a WebEx app that is available on mobile devices, and then you can also just call in for the audio part of the meeting. Obviously, wouldn't be able to see the slides. If you do have any, or if you're having any difficulties, there are instructions available up on the DUAB webpage under the Fiscal Indicator Committee meetings web link. Those instructions can kind of help you both how to log in as well as how to chat and or raise your hand. For the attendees, you are all on mute at this point in time. You also are not able to see if there are other attendees on the line. Let me reassure you that there are. This is just the way WebEx kind of sets up these events that for whatever reason it just says that shows you that you're the only attendee. But we do have many attendees already, and I'm certain we'll have some additional ones show up as we go along. And as before, this meeting is being recorded. We will make that link available up through our DUAB webpage. So with that, this is our agenda for today. Pretty similar to last week's. So we've already kind of done call to order and compliance with open door law. So first what I want to do is do a committee discussion, again, on the existing or potential indicators. What I have done since our last meeting is to take the feedback that we received last meeting and tried to mock up some of these indicators or some of the ways in which we could modify the indicators. I'm going to let you all know up front that some of these are not very pretty. Excel is a little bit limited in the way that I can do some things. Fortunately, when we actually do the real indicators out on the dashboard, that's through Tableau. Definitely more advanced than what I can accomplish in Excel. So I apologize for the look of some of these, but just trying to get the general feel for what this could look like. And then also on a lot of what you're going to see here, I've just kind of made notes of different ideas that came to the forefront during the last meeting. Again, none of these are final at this point. This is really just for us to continue that conversation. I think just looking forward, what my expectation would be is we go through today's discussion and hopefully help to kind of whittle down to where the committee feels most comfortable, and then leave that door open for folks to provide comment, either both through the public comment opportunity today, or also always submitting comments through email or voicemail, which we'll talk about when we get to that part. And then my thought would be that the committee probably will need to come together one last time to officially finalize what those indicators will be once we have feedback from others as well. So with that being said, I think we'll go ahead and jump in. Well, first, committee members, do any of you have any questions or comments that you want to start with? All right. Seeing none, we'll jump on in. So the way I have set this up on these slides is that I've included a screenshot of the current indicator, and then depending on what the different scenarios are that we've talked about, I've got options after this. So we can talk through different ones and click back and forth through slides as needed. So the first one that we have up here is ADM. This is a fairly straightforward chart that we currently have. During our last meeting, we talked a bit about whether or not we should include the fall and the spring count, now that the spring count is actually tracking and has an impact on the overall tuition support for a school corporation. So the first option that I have here shows that scenario where basically you see here for 2020, I've just kind of made up some numbers here, but I've dropped in a number for what that spring count was for this school corporation. And then one thing that we had received in the comments last time was having the option to kind of turn on only the fall count or only the spring count. So that could be something where we would have that as selection options on this particular indicator. So if somebody just was interested in seeing the spring count, they would have the ability to do that. I'll also jump to the next one, since it's kind of two different versions of ADM. This next one is fairly similar. I got a little bit restricted here on what Excel can do. What you need to imagine is the FY 2020 fall count and the FY 2020 spring count would ideally look similar to what it looked like on the last slide. Excel does not like both clustered and stacked columns, so I couldn't show it exactly how I wanted it. The difference here for this slide as compared to the prior slide is that this one also shows the distinction between in-person and virtual. That's something we had talked about during the last meeting, is whether we should start to show the virtual students as well, since that does have a different funding formula for the virtual students in terms of the percentage that is received. So on this variation, I think from selection boxes, what I could possibly see would be, again, you could possibly still have that fall and spring count selection options, and then also possibly an in-person and a virtual selection option. So kind of we'll start there. I know I have one other question here to talk about, but we'll start there just kind of with the two different charts and see what you all think about those.
This is Melissa. I just have a general comment. Would we, and it's something to consider, would we include a spring count for those years in which it wasn't used in the formula? Because we've always taken fall and spring. Some years it's in, some years it's out. So that's just something we would have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly open to people's thoughts on that.
And I also like the idea personally of including the virtual versus non-virtual count, because it does, as you said, play into funding. And I think it will be interesting to track whether schools, like school corporations themselves, grow virtual programs in the future. So it would just be interesting to track what's happening with virtual students as well. And it's of interest to the General Assembly, it seems, from year to year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just curious for the current school year, would we count the distance learners due to COVID onto the regular, would we call them virtual? Because they're currently being funded 100%, and I think it's kind of a little misleading if we have 30, we'll just use 30% for this fiscal year being shown as virtual as compared to other years, but even though they're getting paid, funded, at the full amount, it could be some inconsistencies.
My general thought on that is that even though they are virtual due to COVID, the way the amended rule looks at them feeds them into a virtual count or a non-virtual count for display purposes. So in the case, Rob, maybe of a school that has a lot of virtual due to COVID kids, my guess is the majority of them fell into the non-virtual count, as you said, and are funded at 100%. And you could always kind of have a caveat on, here's what was interesting about fiscal year 21.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the real goal here of differentiating the virtual students is to show that they are at a different funding level. And so even those virtual due to COVID, but being funded at 100%, it feels like they would be grouped into that in-person. And maybe there's a better descriptor there than in-person. But certainly I agree. I think having a good note there that indicates what that really means would be important as well.
The only other question I would have is I think it was on these couple ADM slides going together, is previously when you were able to put the two columns close together for a particular fiscal year, like on this slide, it went back to 2012. On the other slide, because we're having two full columns, one for the spring and one for the fall, it's almost as if we're having two columns for each year here, where it's a little bit better on the other slide. It might just be an Excel thing. Maybe we can, I know you were saying that doesn't like doing both. So I don't know if that's a change. I get really what I'm saying is if we're going to have both of these charts, I think we should have the same year's representative as far considering how far it goes back, so that's consistent. Sure. So if it's going to take two full columns on this slide, then maybe we only go back so many years on the prior, just for consistency purposes.
Sure.
It also may just be a formatting thing regarding the software too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. My thought is we would only show one of these two charts. In this case, this is the look that I prefer, kind of having those two columns close together and grouped under 1 year. But I couldn't also then add in the distinction between in-person and virtual, and that's just more of an Excel limitation, I believe. So my goal would be that I think it would look very similar to this chart, except on the top of these columns, you'd have the little other extra rectangle that designates what's virtual.
I think that'd be good.
Good.
Yeah, and if we're worried about like the formatting stuff, like Tableau should be able to handle that, and we can show kind of the side-by-side bars, or we can put like a button at the top where you can select fall or spring, and that'll kind of help condense the two charts as well.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Now, I do want to, I know we have this other question here, but I want to circle back to the question Melissa asked of when we would show that spring count. And I think we touched on that a little bit last meeting, but want to just make sure we're all on that same page. My thought would be that the spring count is only shown when it actually impacts the financial situation of the school corporation. So even though we've had, for many years now, we've collected that February count, since it hasn't necessarily fed into the actual formula, I think I would be of the opinion that we would not show it here. We'd only show it once it really impacts the funding.
This is Neil. I'm definitely supportive of that. Just on the flip side, you could also show it, but denote somewhere on the screen what years did or did not count. But I'm totally supportive of your method, though, but just offering another suggestion.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, I think I like Neil's idea too, because since fiscal year 14, I believe the only 2 years we did not use February was in fiscal year 18 and 19. So they're like right in the middle of everything you're seeing, and it's going to kind of look goofy if you show 14, 15, 16, 17, then 1, 1, 2, 2.
Okay. Okay. So show it for all years, and then make some type of note there, or find some way to designate when it counted towards the tuition support and when it did not.
Yeah, I wonder if you could color code the bar, like if it's green, it was for funding. If it was red in February, it wasn't used for funding, or just something at a glance that points it out.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. Then I do want to circle back to this question that I have down here. This is a question that came in during the last meeting. I don't think we addressed it. So if we do want to go down the road of showing virtual students, the question was received of should there be some sort of threshold at which we would show those, or would we just show those for all school corporations all the time? And I think I don't necessarily know the full thought process behind the question, but one thought I had as I was thinking about this question is if we had a school corporation that only had a handful of virtual students, are we running any risks with privacy concerns? And that's, I just don't know those rules and laws well enough. I just have seen it before where sometimes if you have a small enough pool, you don't end up showing that number just because you don't want people to be able to identify. But just kind of throwing that thought out there.
When you mentioned this, my immediate thought was schools, when they reach a threshold, I think of 100 virtual students or 30% of their enrollment, whichever is less, they have to create like a school program that's virtual. If we do a threshold, maybe that's it, because then that would pull in those schools that do have virtual programs, which are public and being offered, at the school. So that could be an example of a threshold if people want a threshold, because there are schools out there that definitely have less than 10 students, although you can't identify them from a whole number. But there are schools that would just like show a blip of a line on the virtual students.
Right. Okay. Well, so I think that I'm going to kind of place that question out there as a question that maybe still remains for us to think through. And certainly, especially for those who are on the line right now, I'd encourage you to also think about that. And if you have thoughts on whether or not we should have that kind of a threshold there on the virtual students, or should we just show virtual students all the time, I would ask for public feedback on that question. All right. So then I'm going to jump to the next slide, and this is different than anything we've looked at, but kind of touched. We started to have this conversation last week, and so I put something together just to see if we feel like it's helpful. So basically, last week on the ADM discussion, one of the questions that had popped up was, should we also be breaking out which students are in district and which ones have transferred in from outside of the district? I think the concern for me was it's equally important for me to see who has transferred out and how many have transferred out as it is to see how many have transferred in. So I put together this chart. Could not figure out how to get it done in Excel, so I literally just kind of drew this up myself. But the thought here is taking the public transfer reports that we have that go back to FY 2018, which was the fall 2017 count, and showing for each of the years that we have the data, and then we could also drop in the spring numbers where we have the spring numbers, but show, did this school corporation gain students or did they lose students? One thing I also, as I was looking at this data, I wanted to make sure to document what the current ADM was, because, for example, if you have a very, very large school corporation, they may lose over 1,000 students, which alone seems, extreme. But once you also realize how many students they still have within their school corporation, maybe that's less of a concern. So just trying to kind of capture both the ins, the outs, and what that basis is for the overall ADM. What do folks think of this?
I got a question. What's the definition of a student transfer in the sense of does this include kids who live in your district but get a voucher and go to a parochial school who've never been in your building at all?
Yes. So what I did was take the public transfer reports. And so where it starts with students that are in legal settlement within your school corporation, then it adds public transfers in, and then it includes 2 transfers out, one to the parochial type of schools, and then there's another, I think there's a public transfer out. So both of those transfer outs would be included in the red bars here. So yes, it's really starting from, and that was the other challenge here, because I was trying to find a way, were there ratios or percentages I could come up with, but for the students going out, you're really starting from how many students reside within your district, and the students coming in, the basis is really your ADM, and so I was struggling to come up with any percentage necessarily that I could look at, which is why this was kind of the only way I could visualize it, but open to other ideas as well.
I guess my only concern is many school districts across the state have closed enrollment and do not accept transfers in. But so a chart like this, any kid, you're not really going to have many greens at all unless it's maybe staff members who live outside the district who bring their kids in. But that's generally minimal. So if you have closed enrollment, you're going to have nothing, you're hardly everything on the green side, and then your red side is when it includes all the kids going to parochial schools. I sometimes think that's very misleading because many of those kids, if not most of them, never stepped in your building since day one in kindergarten. And it looks as if you're losing kids, but you never had them in the first place. So, and I'm not sure if there's a way to segregate that information, but I guess that would only be a concern of mine, that you're in a closed district, you don't let people in or out, and you're not losing kids because you never had them. I don't have an answer. That would be a concern of mine.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, this is something, like I had said during the last meeting, I mean, I definitely, when I prepare to go do an assessment with a school corporation, this is something that I do look at, just to have kind of that feel of both what type of competition they have surrounding their district or within their district, depending on the situation. And then also just overall, yeah, are they gaining students, or are they more, on the side of losing students? So I think it is important, but I can understand what you're saying. Could it be misleading? And I think, especially for the indicators perspective, I think when we get to the assessment process, there's a little more flexibility there in how we analyze things, because that is all more of a confidential process. But I want to be sure that from an indicator perspective, we're not creating a situation that's misleading to anyone. All right. Well, on this one, I'm going to kind of, again, I'll pose this out to the folks on the phone. We'll phone a friend on this as well and ask for feedback. Certainly interested to know people's thoughts on whether or not this is a helpful type of chart. Again, I think from a DUAB perspective, I can see where it is helpful, but also want to make sure from a school perspective that folks feel that this is something that is helpful. All right. next then we'll jump into fund balance. So this was just, again, this is the current version of fund balance. And the big thing here is that you notice that we have, and this will be on a number of the charts, right now we break things into kind of 5 different categories. From before it was general fund, operational, other local funds, rainy day, and then all other funds. So kind of some broad categories there, especially when you get to that all other funds. During our last meeting, we had a conversation of saying, well, should we try to tie this more closely to the way that things are reported on other reports, namely identifying some of the state funds and federal funds separate. And then we also had comments during the last meeting regarding the impact of debt on these particular charts. This, and then also I'd say the deficit and surplus chart, and how if you have happened to do a large bond issue in a given year, so you have all those bond proceeds, that can really sway things one direction or another. So the first thing that I did was to try to say, well, if we wanted to be more detailed and have more flexibility in the way that we identify the funds, I tried to create what those classifications could be. There's a lot, so I may have gone too far. But just trying to figure out if somebody wanted to sit down and, you know, really try to dig into finances and be able to distinguish where there were some anomalies, I've kind of broken it out in this way. So I would still have the general fund for prior years, which then obviously would switch over to educational funds starting with 2019. Operational funds, which before 2019 would have been your capital projects, bus and transportation, and then just your operations fund in 2019. Rainy day separate. I broke out the 3 referendums separately because, again, there's such a distinction to me between an operating referendum and a capital referendum. I know school safety referendum is still new, so that one maybe plays in a little bit more moving forward. Then I did a debt/capital category. In this category, I've included probably 2 sets of funds that may not necessarily belong together, but one is the debt service funds, where you're actually, you know, collecting that property tax to repay your debt. And then I've also included more of those construction funds where the bond proceeds would land. So they're not completely one and the same, but just, again, trying to isolate the impact of those bond issuances. Then local funds, it's kind of all other local funds outside of what's listed above, and then a state funds and a federal funds grouping. So again, I know it's a lot, but I'd love to hear what you all think, and is this helpful to be able to break it down in this more detailed way?
I do think it's a lot, but I like it because you could pull the combination of funds that you want to look at. And I like the breakout between local, state, and federal at the bottom of what remains. And I do think it's important to know whether the referendum you're looking at is more likely to be operational in nature versus school safety or a capital project or something like that. I don't have a problem with the number or the breakout that you have here. I personally kind of like it based on information requests we get. Sometimes people just want to know education fund only, and then this would give them a snapshot. Other times today we have people that want to know debt. So I think this is a nice summary.
I agree with Melissa. I would recommend adding the trust funds as a separate category as well, because including with the withholding funds as well, those aren't really the school's funds at all. So that's included in all other funds that may be interpreted to mean that they could use that money when really they're just holding it for something else.
Okay. All right. That may be something I need to circle back with either you or Melissa on to make sure I'm capturing those correctly, and making sure we're able to isolate the flow of cash there.
I guess that would depend on where you're pulling the data from. If you're pulling it from the Form 9s, those trust funds aren't on there in the first place.
Okay. Yeah, and I am pulling Form 9, and really when I look at revenues and expenditures, I don't include any of the exceptions or anything like that. I just include sections 1 and sections 2 from the Form 9. So, and so that may be why I'm not as familiar with the trust funds as other situations. All right. Okay, so as we move through this, you're going to see things. Well, you're going to see me kind of say fund classifications. This list is really what I mean in terms of providing those selection boxes. So just kind of keep that in mind. I didn't retype it every time. Okay, so fund balance. Basically, I have here an updated version of the chart. It's essentially the same chart. I think fund balance, there's not that much you can necessarily do with it. I have dropped in kind of a thick line here between 18 and 19 to help denote the difference. And certainly would have a note on here that would explain that there was a change. The way I have this set up right now, I'd have selection boxes for those different fund classifications, so you could identify which ones you want included. The way that the current indicator is and the way I have it set up here shows each of those categories still separately, kind of more of this disaggregated, as I would say. A question would be if a user comes in and says, well, I'm interested in these 5 categories of funds, should we actually aggregate that so that you're really only getting the one line of fund balance? And you can kind of see what that total fund balance is for those 5 types. Or is it beneficial to be able to see each of the types separately?
I would probably, I don't know, I guess if they're wanting to see 5 different funds, I would think they would want to see what each fund is doing in comparison to the next. So I'm not sure I'd want to see them consolidated into one.
Right. Okay.
Courtney, I guess this is more of a question for you taking it to when you would potentially go to the next level for more of a investigative look. But I agree with Melissa. I do like how we can see all of them. My question is, there is a lot of, because of the number in this example, there's a lot of different bars going up, and it condenses things by showing, the prior 8 years. And I'm just throwing this out there. Do we need to show 8 years, or because of the amount of information here, would we condense this to maybe only go back 4? That way it's bigger and more legible to see. But where I defer to Courtney is, how much back information is really applicable and are you using? Because if you can go back 20 years, you can go back 3 years. And I'm guessing from the committee's talk last year, 8 years was probably a good number that they came up with. But it is, in 2020, what I was doing in 2012 as applicable now as maybe just the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I would defer to you about, when you're going and really looking at an indicator, because really we got to take a step back and think what the purpose of all this is. It is to be an indicator to see trends and where things are going. So obviously the longer time span, the more of a trend you can see, but I just kind of bring that open for discussion. I'm not saying one way or another.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say from my perspective, certainly the more recent years are probably, I would say they're more important. But from a DUEB perspective, we did look backwards, especially, so when we did, I'm trying to think, when we decided on which school corporations would be a part of the assessment process that was conducted in 2019, the years of data we were looking at there was 2020 through 2017. And so, if we saw something back 2012, 2013, where it looked like a school corporation was having some difficulty, but then they seem to have come back out of it, certainly we'd look at all of the different indicators, but that would be something that we would keep an eye on, because what we'd want to see is, well, okay, they had some difficulty, things have clearly changed course. Is that change sustainable, or did they do something that's more short-term in nature, to where we run the risk that they're going to go down again in the future? So that is something that we looked at, but I can certainly understand your point in terms of what is that right mix. I think when the committee first set up these indicators, we went back to 2010, largely because that's really right after all of the major changes in terms of school funding. So we kind of went back as far as we could while still staying fairly comparable over time.
So kind of a follow-up to what Rob said, what if you show in the graph 5 years, and believe me, I'm not tech savvy, but if you showed 5 years in the graph that's visible initially, could you have like an advanced option that takes you back, to 2012 if you want, but just for public display purposes initially, it just shows 5 years, and then if somebody wants to dig more into it, they can pull up the remaining years?
That's something I'd have to work with MPH on and see what those options are. Maybe there's some type of selection boxes or something there that the user can identify what, here's the default, but they can choose to see more if they so choose. But I'd have to work with MPH on the technology piece of that. Okay. And that's something I can look into before we get back together again.
Going with one of your original questions, the ironic thing is I see the benefit of showing both disaggregated as it is here and also showing it in the aggregate as a whole. Is there, again, this might be more of a question for the technology people, but is there a way to maybe toggle both, that there's an option, check this box for aggregated, check this box for disaggregated, and that way you can give the detail and you can give it in the aggregate over time as well. Because I do see the benefit of showing it both ways.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, that's. I'll take that back to the tech folks and see what can be done. So kind of along those lines of having different options, another question that we had gotten during the last meeting that I failed to bring forward and talk through was an option, largely I believe on this chart and maybe on others, but to look at this per ADM. So you could have, obviously right now what I've presented here are just kind of the raw numbers of fund balances. But is it helpful to be able to standardize this and look at it per ADM? All right. We will leave that as a question that's kind of out there, and look for folks if they have any feedback on that idea. Okay. So next we have the annual deficit surplus. Okay, so I do have a couple options on this one. So this is the current version. This would be a modified version, basically the same thing that we had on our existing indicators. the only difference here would be that we would expand the selection boxes to kind of the new groupings of whatever we choose those groupings to be for fund classification purposes. But essentially looks the same. Again, Excel kind of forced me to have my fund balance here in a line. I think right now on our current indicator, it just kind of has this slash mark to kind of show where it is, which I like this probably a little bit more than the line idea. So this would be one option. And then I also did a different version of this so right now on this chart, we have the blue column is revenue, the red column is expenses, and then the green column is that deficit or surplus. So for this other chart, I dropped out revenue and expenses, and I just left a deficit surplus. So again, I still have here that you can categorize it by fund or fund classification. But this kind of would allow you to better see, like this is all aggregated right now in our current indicator. So if you select all of the different options for funds, then you're going to see total revenue for all of those funds, total expenses for all the funds, and total deficit surplus. So this would be kind of more of the disaggregated view of it by fund classification.
Personally, I like the first one better, the aggregated total, because then you're picking as I talked last week, being the one on the panel here who's had to present this to my board and to my taxpayers, I spent a lot of time just like on this annual deficit surplus trying to explain how it was misleading, and some funds looked as if we were creating a deficit, and it was just more of a timing issue for the things we already explained. So the fact that if I can just eliminate those funds that are kind of not really, I'm going to say skewing the data, but not really truly representing how those funds work, that would simplify things for me or for us out here. And I think kind of showing the overall plus revenue and expenses, like on this one, I think that's good. I guess my other thought process is, and this is just the full philosophy that we have at our school district, is, we have to have an operating balance in order for cash flow purposes, but in reality, I don't want to have high cash balances in my funds, and I should be operating pretty close to the margin all the time. We're using taxpayer money to educate these kids that we have now, not to stockpile a bunch of cash. So like on your second slide, I would expect most of my funds to be right there, small, very close to the margin. And so it wouldn't really be telling me much, because I would expect all my funds to be there. And if I have a big anomaly, like in this example where I've got the operating money or referendum money coming in as a annual deficit, I'm like, well, how come I'm getting $15 million or $20 million more in than I'm spending? I'd have a concern about that. So I personally, as one who's out here, I think the other one is just as good, as long as we can pull out the funds that really kind of skew the data. And by having those additional classifications, we could accomplish that. But that's, again, my opinion.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I certainly can understand what you're saying with this particular chart. I could see where it could cause a lot more questions. For example, well, why is there a deficit in this particular category? Well, maybe it's because there was a planned spending, like in this particular case, this is the operational fund. So that obviously also includes capital projects or bus purchases or things like that could all be wrapped in there. So could be perfectly valid explanations for it, but showing it this way highlights it perhaps more than what you would have here, where it would really be kind of more grouped in with other things. All right. Okay. Before we go further, I have one question here, and I am getting other comments that I will make sure that I get to the board or to the committee as well, so everybody can kind of think through them. But a question I did get here that may be of benefit for everybody on the phone is, will these graphs also continue to be complemented with data tables? And yes, that would be our expectation, is similar to how you currently can click on the chart and go to a See Data Here option, and then it kind of takes you to a separate data table page. Yes, we would still make that data available. And then also on our fiscal indicators page on the DUAB web page, we also do have a full spreadsheet where you can download all of the data for all of the school corporations at once. So that is always available for folks as well. All right. All right. Then we're going to jump to fund balance as percent of expenditures. So this is our current version. So then for the second version, so I've remarked this up. Essentially, the chart itself is the same as what it currently looks like. Really, where I think there can be some distinctions would be what you should be able to include in here. So under our current indicator right now, you can include general, operational, or rainy day. So the first selection option that I would have here as an option is general/educational. What I don't want somebody to do is have those kind of separate, so then suddenly, if you only select general, then suddenly 2019 doesn't include the education fund. So I think you'd have to select, if you're going to select general or education, you need to have the other corresponding fund from the other years. And then operational and rainy day, so very similar to what we currently have. Another option that I thought of would be that you could run this essentially to just always include general, educational, and operational. And then really the only option here would be whether or not you include the rainy day. That it does limit a user's ability to kind of look at this table in the ways that they want, but it perhaps creates a situation where we can ensure that they're always looking at it consistently across the years. And then I'll also throw in, before we start to talk, I'll throw in this third item here, is whether or not operating referendum is something that should be captured in this chart, or at least available as an option. Again, I don't know necessarily where I fall on that. It was just a thought that I had as I was thinking through how you would want to parse this particular one out.
I think operating referendum definitely needs to be in there because it is part of your ongoing everyday, no pun intended, but operating of the school district. Whether or not it's adding programs or helping with circuit breaker impact, but it is just as big of a piece of how you operate every day as those other funds. So if the school district has it, I think it should be listed. And I do like having the flexibility of picking and choosing which funds. So I wouldn't necessarily be as much of a fan of it automatically always includes the general and education and operational, but I would just have 4 of them that are options: the general/education, operations, rainy day, and operating referendum. And then the user will get consistent information. Personally, again, me being one who's presenting, I would click all 4 of those boxes, because it really, between the way the money moves between the funds, to tell the true story of the district, you need to include all of them to tell the whole story. But that doesn't mean that you can't show whomever, okay, this is only education fund, this is how we're doing an operating referendum, but now when I click all 4 boxes, here's the whole story of the district. So I like having the flexibility, but I would like to have all 4 of those.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
And I lean toward what Rob is saying as well. You should include all 4. In thinking about this as used by DUAP and others, they should be looking at those 4 funds at a minimum if they're really looking at what's going on with a particular school. So it does make sense definitely to have the operating referendum in there as well.
Okay. Great. All right. Then let's go ahead and talk through these last 2 bullet points. This is something we did talk a little bit about last time, but wanted to circle back, see if anybody had any additional thoughts. So we had received a comment during the last meeting about including an option, or either automatically including it or including an option to have a state average shown on here. And then I took it kind of one extra step was, well, you could do state average for everybody, or maybe also you would want to look at state average by ADM quartile or something like that to get to this concept of, a smaller school corporation maybe needs to have a higher fund balance just in general, rather than more of a medium or a large size school corporation. So, just kind of seeing what thoughts are on that. I know we also talked a little bit about, would there be a state benchmark that says, oh, here's where that should be. I think similar to what I said last week, I don't know that we want to go to that place at this point in time, especially since this is really the first year that we'll be including the new funds, and everybody's still kind of adjusting to how the money flows between all these funds. Maybe somewhere down the road we get there, but I don't think at this point we'd want to go there, but state average might be something we could do. Now, we did receive on the meeting the last time, we did receive a comment of sometimes that state average may be misleading as compared to what the local policies are. So I think this is probably a question where we're never going to make everybody happy. So it's just what we think is best for the majority.
Well, I think when we show this graph, the first question that a board member or someone is going to ask, or should ask if it's not explained by the business manager in the first place, is kind of goes back to what you said. Okay, hey, this shows that we have, on this graph between 30 and 45%. The first question generally is, are you comfortable with that number? What percentage do you want it to be, or what is your goal? What should it be? And as Courtney said, that could vary from district to district. So I agree that maybe we shy away from having an overall benchmark to kind of paint a brush for everybody. State average, I guess I'd be open to that, because that kind of goes back to the same thing. Well, yes, we're at 30%. Well, how does that compare to other school districts? Still doesn't address the local policy, because just because someone else has a high fund balance doesn't necessarily mean that I feel that I need to have a high fund balance. So I think the local unit just needs, the business manager just needs to be able to reflect what their own school district's policy is on that, or philosophy, so to speak, and be able to convey that. But as I talked about last week, you're only presenting this to your board and your public in a public meeting probably one time a year, even though this data is there year-round for the general user to use. So with all of these, sometimes the data is good, but to the average person, they may not know, well, yeah, well, I see these percentages here, but what's it supposed to be? Is it supposed to be 10 or is it supposed to be 50? So unless you knew some other piece of it, and if you don't hear the school official explaining, it tells you information, but it may not really tell you the core of what the value is. So I don't have an answer. The state, but if you did state average, that's at least giving the public user at least something to compare these numbers to. And your individual school district may be higher or lower than that, but that's where you can be prepared to answer those questions. The only question I would have, and again, this is more of a logistical technology question for state average, would be if I only clicked education/general fund, then would that state average only be pulling the education fund from all the other school districts across the state? And when I click 3 boxes, is it going to pick up those 3 boxes? That's what I just want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples too.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I wonder if it would be too much trouble to consider something like when you're doing a comparison to other on a statewide basis or ADM quartile or something like that. I know in some areas when we do analysis, we have all schools classified and we consistently use it as like urban, suburban, et cetera. What if there is an average where you put those types of schools together? And then that way you're kind of comparing rural to rural, suburban to urban, or suburban to suburban, urban, et cetera. Because I was trying to pull it up and I can't remember if the dollars to classroom report shows something like that. So that's just kind of another way to lump the data together, but I don't know if it would be too difficult to do it that way. But it would then give you an average compared to other like size or like type school districts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think that's something. Oh wait, Neil, are you there? Or
No,
Tyler, there it's Tyler.
currently dollars to the classroom breaks out by education service centers. That's another possibility as well.
Okay. So is that's more locational then?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, that's more location within the state.
Okay.
But I think at one point, Melissa might have been right that it did break out in that fashion, just not as of late. I can go back and look, but I think you're right.
Okay.
One question I would have on these state averages, and particularly if we include operating referendum as an option for what to include in this chart, trying to figure out how that starts to sway what's included in the state average calculation. And maybe I just need to think through that, because if you have a situation of you have a school corp that does have an operating referendum, you know, when we would run that state average, if you have somebody who doesn't, do you just include a 0 there for that fund category, or how do you isolate the impact of that? Or do you only look, if you have the operating referendum box checked, do you only look at those school corporations that also have an operating referendum, which then I think starts to get pretty complicated and potentially behind the scenes messy of who's included and who's not in those calculations.
That's a very good point. The operating fund revenue, I mean, it's providing the additional support that district needs to operate. So it is bumping up their average compared to others. But yeah, I guess that is kind of an interesting qualm about doing that. In a way, I feel like it should be included because it's being used for operational purposes, and it gives a more accurate picture of what is going on within that particular district. Mm-hmm. So if you exclude it, then you're automatically making that district appear to have a more unfavorable picture than it might have. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Be interesting to hear if anyone has any comments on that.
All right, we'll phone a friend on that too. Oh, Rob, you got something?
Yeah, I guess I was just gonna, again, those are great points. As with everything on this, as this committee's heard, Dave say before me, and we all know that, it still comes down to every school district being able to tell their story. And I think we still got to remember to try to keep these 8 indicators as simple and basic as possible and leave it up to the school to be able to explain their story. And so after hearing what you said here, maybe on this one, I still firmly believe we need to have the operating referendum as a box to check to include, but maybe not including those state averages. And then each school just tells their story. Yeah, we're at 25%. That's our goal. Because I'd rather put it on the school to tell the deeper story than to have additional information in there that may make things appear in a way that they really aren't. Mm-hmm. So I think it still needs to come down to the school level, because we could all tell our story and we could all explain what's going on.
Sure.
So I guess now I'm kind of leaning maybe toward not putting a state average in there. Because again, it goes back to, if I have a policy that says I want between 10 and 15%, if the state average is 30, it doesn't really matter to me. Mm-hmm. So,
right. Okay. All right. Yeah, and again, I think that this is probably a conversation where let's say we go through this process this year and we say, no, right now let's not include it because of some of these challenges of how to best present that. I think this is a question that's going to come up every year probably, because it is something, like I've said, it's something that people want. They're interested in having that type of information out there, but maybe there's a different way for us to do it. Maybe instead of having something that is on a particular school corporation's indicator, but with a line there that says state average, maybe there's a way that there's a separate state average report or something like that, to where if someone just goes out and looks at a school corporation, they get the school corporation's data. But if they are interested more in some of that statewide information, it's still there, just kind of in a different spot. Just something we'll have to continue to think through as we continue to go through this process. All right. Next, we have tuition support per ADM versus general fund expenditures per ADM. So we brought this up last time and talked about the potential impact of the change in the accounting structure and the way that we have the transfers now, and how that would impact this one. And so I actually went back and looked at the numbers. And so for 2018, we had 226 out of our 289 school corporations where the general fund expenditures per ADM were higher than your tuition support per ADM. When we move to 2019, that number drops to 12. So a very, very significant change because of the accounting structure change and the way that the transfers now impact this. So based on that and seeing that it does change and really impacts what I'll call the red flag that we would have typically seen in that indicator. So I'll kind of throw out, maybe this indicator is something that shouldn't exist anymore. Maybe it's just not, as we move forward, maybe it's not as valuable as it was in the past. Or another variation that I thought of would be, should we go in and somehow modify the tuition support number to remove the amount that was transferred and then still do a similar comparison as to what we had in the past. And then kind of a third option that I just included here is, or is there something else that we think would be beneficial? One that has been proposed to me would just be straight, revenue per ADM and expenditures per ADM. Does that accomplish something similar to what we were looking at with this indicator?
I'd be interested to see the netting of the transfers from the ed into the operations fund and even the rainy day fund, if there's any transfers there. That might bring this indicator back up to the usefulness that it once was.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something I can certainly run the numbers on. I think I had that thought just late in the day yesterday of maybe that was a way to do it. Now, the one concern I have about it, again, kind of gets back to a comment that I made last time, is that as much as possible, I try to stick to the source data in terms of what is presented. And so if we're removing those transfers, I'll have to figure out if that somehow, I just want to make sure that whatever we're doing, whatever math we're doing, we can always come back to the source document and say this is where that came from. So, but this is one I can run some updated numbers on, try to do that scenario and see if it makes this particularly helpful. All right. Next, revenue by type. So this is our current version. And basically, I couldn't come up with too many other options for this. Looks pretty similar. I think it's, again, it is helpful. It does show us where you kind of have some additional revenue coming in, particularly when you have some large spikes. Helps you to identify what that is. But so essentially this is the same as before. The one thing I would change here would be, whereas right now the current indicator just has kind of the 5 classification of funds that we were using, I would expand that to include the whatever fund classifications we end up finalizing. All right. Next, then, we have operating referendum revenue as percent of total revenue. Again, on the current version, we show the 5 classifications that we were using. So that's kind of, we essentially could do the same thing, but just show all of the different fund classifications that we would be moving towards. Or another option that I thought of would be, instead of grouping this by fund type, is it more helpful to be able to group it by revenue type in terms of what you are including here in this calculation? I didn't update the chart because I think either way the chart's going to look similar. It's just really how it's most beneficial to be able to group what, or to identify what you've included in the mix. I don't know if folks have any thoughts on that.
So your recommendation or your suggestion was to consider by revenue type rather than just total revenue?
Yeah, I kind of have 2 different ideas here in terms of what the user gets to identify to include, either allowing them to select by fund type or allowing them to select by revenue type, which revenue type then would, kind of going back to the revenue chart, it'd be this federal revenue, state revenue, debt, other local operating referendum revenue, and local tax revenue.
Revenue type would be interesting to see what it looks like.
Yeah, and I think from a chart perspective, it's going to look similar. It's just, yeah, how it impacts how you interpret it. Okay. Well, I think that's kind of a question that we can leave out there. And then going to the last indicator was the general fund salaries and benefits as % of general fund expenditures. This one, due to the change in the accounting structure, I think probably this one may need to just be eliminated, I think is where I would be at. I think the ability to transfer the money from the education fund to the operations fund, as well as some of the changes that we had in, like where the superintendent's salary gets paid from. I think for us to try to be able to look at this consistently across the years gets more and more difficult. The other thing that the more and more that I was thinking about this one, the other kind of feedback that I got through the assessment process was oftentimes this particular indicator could be skewed if you had a school corporation that had large contracts, or perhaps they were in a special ed co-op. So, those, they still have teachers that are doing their special ed, but they're not necessarily showing up here under salaries and benefits. So it really started to skew that as well. I think I put out there kind of the option of possibly just eliminating this. I also looked at, well, was there something that could take its place? Would you do total salaries and benefits versus total expenditures? I think, again, that one has the difficulty of what the local situation is with contracts, special ed, transportation, food services, and without understanding that school corporation, it can get really misleading if you start to compare it to other school corporations.
I'm good with removing it.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Well, so I know we still have a lot of kind of questions of the details that are out there, and we've talked about different things here. Before we go to public comments, again, I'll open it up to just, are there other thoughts that you guys have had since our last meeting, or things that you think we should be thinking about that we haven't included here?
I do have a quick question. As part of DUAB, when you've done the review of indicators, have there been things the group wishes they could have seen, or other analysis that maybe you had to do that was outside these indicators, and you guys at DUAB thought, oh, that would have been good to have this for schools, or just kind of generally?
Sure. Trying to think about that. I think at the 30,000 foot level, no. I think the indicators that we had really allowed us to do that high level look. Certainly once we said, okay, this school corporation might be facing challenges, then yes, there's a ton of other information that we would dig in on. A lot of it coming back to some of the qualitative indicators that we had kind of talked about the last round of the committee. But I don't know that there were other items in terms of just that broader look that we were necessarily looking for.
Because I do feel like the indicators are still in a fairly good place with some modifications. And then to go back to Rob's earlier comment, when you start digging deeper, then that's when the schools have to come up and show you their data that explains why they are doing what they're doing. So I do think we have to keep it somewhat at a higher level and not try to dig into the weeds for every school. Otherwise, you're going to be bogged down trying to sort through it all. So
yeah,
I'm
absolutely
satisfied with them.
Okay. All right. Great. All right.
And I would agree with Melissa. You know, I kind of mentioned last week that I've recently gone like through an S&P bond rating, and in essence, they're doing the exact same thing that I think this committee is trying to assess for everybody, is trying to paint a picture of the health of a particular school district. And I was going through my Q&A, the questions that they provide to us here in the field, so to speak, and I really didn't see anything out in there on the questions that I'm getting asked by the bond agencies that either one, we didn't already cover here with these indicators, or two, are kind of more non-measurables, because they do ask a lot about your local economy and your kind of school environment, and those are not measurables to be put here. But looking at the other 20 questions they tend to ask me, I think that this committee, from the history, what they've done and what we've kind of talked about here 2 weeks, is kind of hitting all the points that I've seen the rating agencies ask as well. So, you know, they're the experts who've been doing this for decades, and I think we can use them as kind of like a guide and see if there was anything we're missing, and I didn't notice anything personally.
Great. Great. It's good to hear. All right. We will go ahead and open up to public comment. So for those on the line, what I would ask you to do is to raise your hand on either the WebEx web browser or the WebEx app. I've got just a couple of screenshots here. So if you're in the web browser, if you are in the participants, or if you can open up your participants panel, you should have a little hand down there that you should be allowed to click to say you want to speak. Or if you're in the WebEx app, first you have to go up to the top where there's a little person there with some lines next to them. Click on that. That gets you to the participants panel. And then there is a raise hand option. If we do get folks who want to comment, we'll go through. I'll unmute your line, allow you to speak, and then we'll move on to the next person. But if you'd rather not speak at this particular moment, or you want to kind of think about some of these other questions that we've posed, a couple of other ways to get us your feedback. One would be to email us at indicators@duab.in.gov. Or you can also leave a voicemail at 317-234-2273. Either of those ways, whether it's emailed or voicemail, I will make sure that that gets to all of the committee members prior to our next meeting. So with that, I'm happy to, all right, I do have somebody here who would like to comment. So we've got Terry Spradlin. Let me go ahead and unmute you. All right, Terry, are you there?
Courtney, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Outstanding. Hey, I just want to thank all of you for your time and effort that you put in looking through these indicators and choosing the best to really illustrate the financial condition of each school corporation in Indiana. This is very important information that gets posted and available in the month of December before January 1. And you know, I really appreciate the work to update the indicators based on the change in accounting structure. My question for you is this. I joined late, so I didn't hear your next steps. And now that you've made some decisions on which indicators to include or how to modify existing indicators or add new ones, will you be able to present to the public for comment and an opportunity for us to weigh in on a mock draft of what the new report will look like with the final indicators that you've selected? Would there be a public comment period where we can weigh in once we have a chance to really see what you've developed over these last two meetings?
Sure. So I think what I can do is probably take some of these mock-ups that we had in this particular meeting, and especially where we do have questions outstanding on them. I can kind of identify what those questions are and where in particular we would like to have some feedback. And then I think that's something we can post to our Fiscal Indicators webpage, as well as push out on the Fiscal Indicators list, so people kind of know where we're looking for some additional comment. I do feel like, based on today's discussion, I feel like we're in a pretty good place in terms of where we're headed with the indicators, but to me, it feels like we still have some details that I certainly would welcome feedback on from others who are in the school finance world.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Anyone else who would like to provide a comment? Okay. All right. I am not seeing any here. One thing I do want to make sure that you all know, so I have been receiving some chat messages during this meeting. Haven't done as good of a job this time of kind of sharing those with everybody. But what I will do is, after this meeting, I will save those chat messages and I will get those out to the committee because some of these do address some of the details of what we were talking about. So I'll make sure that the committee receives all of the chat messages as well. All right. So I think the last thing here, I would first call for any new business from the committee. All right, and seeing none, then what we'll go ahead in just a second, we will go ahead and adjourn. But before we do, I wanted to just give a kind of a standard note that I make to every meeting. When you exit out of here, a survey will pop up. That is on the WebEx experience. If you leave feedback in there, it does not come to the committee. So if you do have any feedback specific to the committee, I would just ask you to email that to us at indicators@duab.in.gov, or you can always leave a voicemail at the number that I had provided earlier. So with that, I think kind of circling back to next steps, like just talking with Terry, I'll go ahead and kind of prep up that summary of where we stand right now and maybe what details are still outstanding. I think that'll be helpful both for the committee, and then I can share that also with others, share that publicly. We'll give a little bit of time here for people to respond back with feedback, and then my plan would be to bring the committee back then sometime in November, and hopefully we'll be able to get to that final set of indicators and say that we're good for this year in terms of how we want to go ahead and present those. So, all right. With that, I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.